When Lena Whitmore stepped into the emergency department in Bullhead City that summer, she was almost unrecognizable, emaciated, with matted hair, cracked skin, and draped in ragged scraps that no longer resembled clothing. 3 years earlier, she had vanished during a hiking trip in Havasu Canyon, one of the most rugged and remote areas of Arizona, and had been officially declared dead. But what truly sent chills down the spines of the doctors and police wasn't her physical condition. The most terrifying part was the signs indicating that those 3 years weren't spent lost in the wilderness, but held captive, day by day, in a place no one would ever suspect. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the early morning of the last day of the trip, the trailhead leading down to Havasu Canyon, Arizona, appeared under dim sunlight and quieter than usual as 21-year-old Lena Whitmore adjusted her backpack straps and left the temporary rest area to continue her solo journey. Lena grew up in a structured family, accustomed to pre-planned schedules and clear safety boundaries, and this independent hiking trip was her personal experiment, a way to prove to herself that she could navigate the wild without relying on anyone else. According to hikers present in the area that morning, Lena appeared in a normal state, not rushed, not stressed, carrying appropriate gear for a short canyon hike, sufficient for safe travel, but not overly bulky, and she showed no hesitation or anxiety as she began the final day of her route. Before the trip, Lena had left a clear itinerary with her family, including the expected return time and the pickup point after leaving the canyon, a familiar habit reflecting her cautious personality. At noon, Lena was seen at a rest spot along the trail leading down to Havasu Creek, where hikers often stop to drink water, rest, and escape the sun, an open area with good visibility and no recorded hazards. Those present at the time recalled that Lena sat resting briefly, repacking her gear, checking her route map, and continuing on the correct path, with no signs of arguments, conflicts, or unusual behavior around her, and the weather conditions at that time were assessed as stable, with clear visibility, and no sudden environmental changes. After that moment, there were no further direct sightings of Lena on the trail, no photos, no calls or messages, and no indications that she encountered an immediate problem. As the afternoon passed and Lena failed to appear at the pre-arranged pickup point, her family initially assumed the delay might stem from the complex terrain or loss of phone signal in the deep canyon, a possibility not uncommon in the area. However, as time stretched into the evening, and all contact attempts yielded no results, worry quickly turned into distinct unease, as every timeline Lena had committed to was broken without any explanation. Her phone could not be reached, and there were no signs that Lena had exited the canyon via any familiar route. By nightfall, as the chance of Lena contacting them or returning on her own grew slim, the family had to accept that this silence was no longer a typical delay but a potential emergency. They contacted the authorities, providing full details on the itinerary, the last known location where Lena was seen, and the complete loss of contact in a rugged terrain area, where even minor deviations could lead to serious consequences. The missing person file was opened immediately afterward, noting Havasu Canyon as the place where Lena Whitmore was last seen, officially marking the moment she vanished from all contact and closing what seemed like a normal day with a prolonged void, where there were no clear traces, no note left behind, and no one knew what had happened after that final moment. Right after Lena Whitmore's missing person file was officially received, the initial search operation was launched with high intensity, following the standard protocol for missing persons cases in wilderness environments. With direct coordination between the Havasupai Tribal Police and the Coconino County Sheriff, the two agencies responsible for security and rescue in Havasu Canyon and the entire surrounding canyon area. In this initial phase, every assessment was consistent on one point: there was no basis yet to consider this a criminal matter. Instead, the search teams focused on the two most common hypotheses in this area, including the possibility that the victim suffered a terrain accident while hiking alone or became disoriented after leaving the main trail. The sweep began from the rest spot where Lena was last reliably documented, treating it as the final high-confidence time and location marker. From this point, teams divided into smaller groups to check each segment of the trail in both uphill and downhill directions, paying special attention to sections with steep drops, slippery rock surfaces, and blind curves where the risk of slipping or falling off the trail was assessed as highest. In parallel with checking the main trail, search groups inspected narrow rock crevices, small tributaries flowing into Havasu Creek, and areas below the trail level, based on the assumption that if Lena had an accident, her body might have been obscured by the terrain or carried away by water from the original position. The search was conducted primarily by manual methods, with teams moving slowly, carefully observing every rock surface, every cluster of vegetation, and every possible hiding spot that could conceal human traces, from snagged clothing and dropped backpacks to signs of unnatural disturbance in the natural environment. Throughout this process, no evidence emerged of a major fall, no long skid marks on rocks were found, no footprints leaving the trail in an unusual direction were detected, and no personal items of Lena were found abandoned randomly, which are common in hiking accident cases. At the same time, the hypothesis that Lena became disoriented was taken seriously, as Havasu Canyon has many unmarked secondary trails formed over time by visitors wandering off, easily causing a solo hiker to unintentionally stray from the main route. Teams expanded the search radius to these secondary paths, checking directions that could lead deeper into the canyon or loop back to less traveled areas, assuming Lena might have taken a wrong turn and lost her bearings. However, even with the expanded scope, the results remained negative. No signs of someone wandering in a panicked state, no unusually prolonged footprint trails were found, and there was no evidence that Lena had attempted to find her way back after getting lost. Notably, throughout the entire searched area, no signs of struggle were recorded, no blood, no drag marks, and no disturbed scene substantial enough to suggest third-party intervention, making the criminal hypothesis almost entirely off the table at this stage. Field reports repeatedly emphasized one common point: the absence of clues. Every assessment relied more on what was not found than on what was discovered, creating a disturbing picture of a disappearance that left no clear physical trace. After many days of continuous searching under harsh terrain conditions and limited visibility due to the canyon's structure, the participating search forces had to reach an initial conclusion that there was no evidence confirming Lena had died in the checked area, nor any basis to assert that a crime had occurred. The initial search operation ended in a temporary deadlock, with the case file recorded as a missing person of unknown cause, reflecting the chilling silence of Havasu Canyon, where Lena Whitmore appeared to have vanished without leaving any tangible sign that could explain her absence. As time passed, additional search efforts still yielded no new results, forcing the authorities to move out of the emergency response phase and shift to a more comprehensive overall assessment, in which all collected data was reviewed again to form an initial conclusion based solely on the remaining objective factors. The Havasupai Tribal Police and Coconino County Sheriff conducted a re-examination of the entire search logs, area maps, reports from each rescue team, and terrain data gathered throughout the operation, with the goal of determining whether any reasonable areas remained unchecked or any plausible hypotheses unconsidered. The narrowing of the search scope was carried out based on the principle of elimination, in which all main and secondary trails within realistic access range from the point where Lena Whitmore was last seen, had been swept multiple times, including the most difficult-to-reach areas that rescue forces could safely access. Field reports consistently agreed that there was no evidence suggesting Lena had moved out of the canyon area in a direction that could lead to residential zones or roadways, and likewise, no signs that she had attempted long-term survival after going missing, such as traces of temporary camps, water sourcing, or distress signals. In parallel with narrowing the scope, a detailed terrain risk assessment was conducted with the involvement of wilderness rescue experts who had many years of experience in missing persons cases in the northern Arizona Canyon region. The assessment report pointed out that Havasu Canyon has numerous factors that make survival after an accident extremely difficult, including sheer vertical cliffs, brittle rock bases, deep crevices unobservable from above, and significant day-to-night temperature swings that can lead to rapid hypothermia. In the case of a solo hiker suffering an injury, even if not immediately fatal, the likelihood of self-rescue or being discovered by others in a short time was rated as very low. These analyses were cross-referenced with the fact that Lena left no signs indicating she had attempted to turn back or seek help, reinforcing the conclusion that a serious incident had occurred shortly after she left the rest spot. Based on the synthesis of these factors, an official conclusion was reached in interagency meetings that Lena Whitmore was classified as presumed deceased, meaning presumed dead, even though no body was found, in accordance with the legal standards applied to high-risk wilderness missing persons cases. Issuing this conclusion reflected a realistic evaluation of survival odds based on the duration of disappearance, terrain conditions, environmental factors, and the complete absence of any survival indicators. Immediately afterward, the case file was updated from missing to presumed dead in the law enforcement management system, a procedural step but one with significant impact on how the case would be handled going forward. The status change meant that active on-site search and rescue operations were terminated, rescue teams were withdrawn from the area, and resources were reallocated to other more urgent tasks. The case was no longer treated as an ongoing emergency, but archived in the category of missing persons cases, with an initial conclusion, pending any new information that might emerge in the future. In internal documents, the authorities clearly noted that the decision to halt active investigation was not based on direct evidence of Lena's death, but on the comprehensive absence of clues, after a search campaign deemed thorough under the actual conditions. The file was closed operationally, along with all reports, maps and collected data, to ensure that if new information or discoveries related to Lena Whitmore should appear in the future, the case could be reopened based on the existing data foundation. 3 years after Lena Whitmore's disappearance was classified as presumed deceased and no longer treated as an emergency case, an entirely different situation unfolded in Bullhead City, a desert town along the Colorado River that frequently handles emergency cases related to extreme heat, homelessness, and environmental exhaustion. That morning, an adult woman was found in critical condition on the outskirts of the city, near an abandoned, no longer operational construction site, a low-traffic area often used as temporary shelter by people without stable housing. The woman lay close to the ground, almost unresponsive when called to or questioned, her body so emaciated that the outlines of bones were clearly visible through dry, cracked skin, her clothing filthy, worn and torn, indicating it had not been changed or washed for a very long time. When medical personnel approached, they quickly realized this was not a typical case of heat exhaustion from the day's sun, but the result of a prolonged process of deterioration. Initial vital signs showed weak pulse, low blood pressure, unstable body temperature, and severe dehydration, severe enough to pose an immediate life-threatening danger without urgent medical intervention. On preliminary examination at the scene, the woman's skin displayed numerous chronic injuries, including thick calluses on her hands and feet, large patches of peeling skin from prolonged sun exposure, old scars interspersed with fresh abrasions, some showing mild signs of infection, but no prior medical care, reflecting that she had been living in unhygienic conditions without access to treatment for an extended period. When asked for her name, age, or any personal information, the woman only produced disjointed, non-sentence sounds, her gaze vacant, sometimes looking directly at the person speaking, but showing no clear awareness, leading medical staff to assess that she was incapable of full communication at the time of discovery. There were no identification documents, phone or personal items that could help establish her identity, and no companions or witnesses who could provide information about when she had appeared in the area. Given the severe emaciation and high risk of death, the decision for immediate hospital admission was made right away, with priority on stabilizing breathing, circulation, and fluid replacement before any further evaluation. During transport to the hospital, emergency physicians continued to note multiple signs indicating the woman had gone through a long period of malnutrition and lack of medical care, including vitamin deficiencies, electrolyte imbalances, and manifestations of prolonged physiological stress, commonly seen in individuals who have been confined, abandoned, or living under strict controlled conditions. Upon hospital arrival, she was taken directly to the emergency department under special monitoring, with initial tests performed concurrently with IV fluids and life support measures. Due to her unstable mental state and limited communication ability, the medical team could not obtain any medical history, personal circumstances, or information that would clarify the victim's origin. Per protocol, the hospital immediately notified local police, as any case of an unidentified adult in critical condition is considered potentially linked to a missing person case or underlying criminal activity. Bullhead City Police arrived to document the initial discovery scene, speak with medical staff, and open a case file, but they encountered the same obstacle. The woman could not provide meaningful statements, did not respond consistently to questions, and showed no signs of alcohol intoxication or stimulant use, gradually ruling out theories of a temporary incident. The absence of substance addiction signs, combined with the prolonged emaciation and chronic injuries, led authorities to assess that this could be a case of abandonment or long-term restricted freedom, although at that point there was no direct evidence to confirm criminal activity. Based on the medical assessment and information gathered on the first day, the case was initially classified as an unidentified endangered adult, reflecting the situation of an unidentified adult facing serious threats to health and life. This classification triggered special protective procedures, including restricting access by unauthorized persons, preserving all physical signs on the victim's body that could hold identificatory or forensic value, and giving absolute priority to treatment aimed at bringing the woman out of critical condition. By the end of the first day of hospitalization, her physical condition showed initial signs of stabilization, but remained highly concerning, while in terms of identity, everything remained completely blank, with the medical record only noting an unnamed woman discovered in severe emaciation in Bullhead City, with no established past, and no clear clues about the path that had led her to her current state. After the unidentified woman was classified as an unidentified endangered adult, and her vital signs were temporarily stabilized, the focus of the authorities shifted to the identity verification phase, a process carried out in parallel between law enforcement and the hospital, with a high degree of caution. Since the victim could not reliably provide personal information herself, cross-referencing with missing persons databases across the state of Arizona and neighboring states began right from the early days of her hospitalization. Investigators collected all non-invasive data possible, including estimated height, biological sex, age range, natural hair color beneath layers of dirt and damage, along with physical features that are difficult to change over time. This information was entered into the National Missing Persons System and compared against cases that had been classified as presumed deceased in previous years, as experience has shown that not a few individuals presumed dead were later found alive after long periods of disappearance. In the initial screening, the number of fully matching files was not large, due to the woman's emaciated condition and skin damage making her appearance far different from archived photos and older reports. Recognizing that relying solely on physical description could lead to errors, investigators expanded verification to biometric checks, focusing on medical signs that are difficult or impossible to fake. The woman's medical record was thoroughly reviewed in search of features, such as old surgical scars, congenital anomalies, healed injuries from years prior, or rare anatomical traits that could match archived medical records in healthcare systems. During the examination, doctors discovered several noteworthy medical traces, including small, deeply healed scars that did not match recent injuries and had characteristics typical of past medical interventions. These signs were carefully documented and forwarded to investigators for comparison with medical data of missing persons, matching the age and sex range. In parallel, certain unchangeable features, such as jawbone structure, ear shape, and some natural asymmetries on the body were also recorded, as these are elements families often recognize even when overall appearance has changed significantly. As the screening process gradually narrowed the field, one particular file began to draw attention: a young woman who went missing 3 years earlier in Havasu Canyon, previously classified as presumed deceased due to a terrain accident, with medical and identifying characteristics showing an increasingly high degree of match with the woman under treatment in Bullhead City. Investigators re-examined the entire old file, including the missing person report, photographs, medical descriptions, and previously stored personal information, noting many similarities that were difficult to consider coincidental. However, given the gravity of confirming identity in a case that had already been ruled a death, the authorities did not rush to a conclusion, and instead proceeded with additional independent verification steps. The family of the missing woman was contacted with extreme caution, initially only informed that an unidentified individual with some matching characteristics was receiving treatment and that their assistance was needed in the identification process. When the family was invited to the hospital to aid in verification, they were psychologically prepared in advance for the possibility that the victim's appearance might be drastically different from their memories, due to the effects of time and harsh living conditions. The meeting took place in a controlled environment, with medical staff and investigators present, to ensure the victim's safety, as well as the objectivity of the identification process. Although the woman was still unable to communicate fluently, her reactions to the presence of family members were carefully noted, including changes in her gaze, emotional expressions, and involuntary reflexes that are not easily faked. The family, based on a combination of many factors such as familiar physical traits, previously known medical markers, and emotional responses, gradually reached a consensus on the woman's identity. After combining the family's confirmation with the results of data cross-referencing and medical evaluation, the authorities officially confirmed that the unidentified woman discovered in Bullhead City was Lena Whitmore, the person who had gone missing 3 years earlier and had been presumed dead in Havasu Canyon. This confirmation was documented in writing according to proper procedure, marking the end of the identity verification phase, and opening an entirely new chapter in legal and investigative handling, in which Lena Whitmore was no longer a name on a missing persons list, but a surviving individual who had just been found in a condition of severe physical and psychological harm. Right after the woman's identity was confirmed as Lena Whitmore, the entire case file was brought up for review at the highest level, because the fact that an individual previously classified as presumed deceased was now determined to be alive fundamentally changed the legal nature of the case. The Coconino County Sheriff proceeded to update the case status in all relevant management systems, officially changing the classification from presumed dead to a live victim, a mandatory adjustment to reflect the new reality, and pave the way for expanded investigative powers. This update simultaneously triggered a review of every operational decision made 3 years earlier, including the terrain risk assessment, the initial search scope, and the reasoning behind the case once being concluded as a fatal terrain accident. In the new context, investigators quickly agreed that the terrain accident hypothesis no longer held explanatory value, as Lena's physical and psychological condition upon discovery indicated a prolonged, systematic process of deterioration that was inconsistent with free survival or wandering in the wilderness. Based on medical, forensic, and circumstantial evaluations, the case was reclassified as a serious criminal matter, with the 2 primary charges identified at this stage being kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, reflecting the determination that Lena had been taken against her will and controlled, held captive for a significant period of time. This reclassification was not based on the victim's statements, which were still insufficient to provide full information, but on the objective synthesis of physical signs, chronic injuries, prolonged lack of care, and complete disconnection from the outside world over multiple years. Once the case was officially regarded as kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, investigative jurisdiction expanded significantly, allowing authorities to apply in-depth criminal investigative measures, including the collection and preservation of medical evidence, analysis of the victim's past travel, communication and financial records, as well as a re-examination of every individual who had contact with Lena prior to her disappearance. Given the high likelihood that the victim had been moved across multiple jurisdictions, possibly even beyond county or state boundaries. The involvement of the Federal Bureau of Investigation was activated in accordance with protocols for kidnappings involving federal elements. The FBI assumed a strategic support and coordination role, providing specialized resources in kidnapping investigation, criminal behavioral analysis, federal tracing, and access to databases that local agencies could not independently reach. In parallel, an interagency investigative task force was established, bringing together representatives from the Coconino County Sheriff, Bullhead City Police, Havasu Tribal Police, and the FBI, to ensure all investigative activities were conducted in a unified manner, avoiding duplication and preventing interruptions due to administrative jurisdictional boundaries. This task force was assigned to reconstruct the entire timeline of the case, beginning from the moment Lena was last seen in Havasu Canyon, extending through the 3-year disappearance period, and ending at the time she was discovered in critical condition in Bullhead City. The reclassification of the case also brought about a fundamental change in the approach to the victim, shifting from an individual requiring only medical support to a victim of serious crime, and at the same time, the central witness in the case. Investigators were strictly instructed not to conduct conventional interrogations, but to work closely with the medical team and psychological experts to ensure every interaction caused no further harm. District and federal prosecutors were notified early about the reclassification to prepare for subsequent legal steps, while specialized teams began building evidence collection strategies with far higher standards of proof than those for an ordinary missing persons case. At the time the reclassification process was completed, Lena Whitmore's file was officially recorded as an ongoing interagency investigation into kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, marking a complete shift in the legal nature of the case, and establishing the foundation for an extensive criminal investigation phase, focused on identifying individual responsibility and the criminal mechanism that had caused a person once presumed dead to reappear in a state of severe harm. After the case was reclassified as kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, Lena Whitmore's medical records became a decisive pillar of evidence, serving not only treatment purposes, but also establishing the actual survival context of the victim throughout the 3 years of disappearance. Doctors conducted a series of in-depth evaluations over many weeks, combining comprehensive blood tests, imaging diagnostics, neurological musculoskeletal examinations, and ongoing monitoring of physiological responses over time. The results showed severe long-term malnutrition in Lena, with biochemical markers reflecting chronic energy deficiency rather than acute starvation. Persistently low albin and pre-albin levels, marked muscle atrophy, and body fat percentage reduced below safe thresholds indicated that her body had adapted over a long period to a poor and unstable diet. This was not the type of emaciation commonly seen in people wandering or living rough and difficult conditions, but still able to access irregular food sources. It was a systematic form of malnutrition reflecting prolonged control over food intake. In addition, imaging diagnostics revealed multiple signs of old fractures in the limbs and ribs, all sharing the characteristic of having healed misaligned, without evidence of proper fixation or medical intervention. These fractures did not occur simultaneously in a single event, but at different times, indicating that Lena had suffered repeated injuries in the past without access to medical care. To medical professionals, the presence of multiple old untreated fractures in a young person is a strong indicator of restricted autonomy, because in conditions of free living, even individuals who avoid the medical system would find it difficult to completely ignore such painful and mobility-limiting injuries. Doctors also noted secondary osteoporosis, which typically only appears when combined with prolonged malnutrition, vitamin D deficiency, and restricted movement, further reinforcing the assessment that Lena had not been permitted or able to move freely for an extended period. Micronutrient testing showed specific deficiencies consistent with a dry environment, including chronic electrolyte imbalances, persistently low sodium, potassium, and magnesium levels, along with severe deficiencies in B vitamins and vitamin D. These deficiencies were inconsistent with a scenario of someone living freely in an urban or semi-urban area, where access to drinking water and supplemental food is relatively feasible, and instead pointed to a tightly controlled living environment, a monotonous, nutrient-poor diet that did not meet minimum physiological needs. Furthermore, rehabilitation physicians identified muscle atrophy, joint stiffness, and reduced range of motion in major joints, particularly the hips, knees, and ankles, manifestations commonly seen in individuals restricted in confined spaces or forced to maintain fixed postures for long periods. These signs were distinctly different from cases of emaciation due to vagrancy, where even under harsh living conditions, the body maintained some level of mobility through constant movement. The medical records also documented physiological signs of prolonged stress, including cardiac arrhythmias, endocrine disorders, immune suppression, and low-grade chronic inflammation, making Lena prone to skin and respiratory infections. These manifestations are commonly seen in victims of prolonged confinement or controlled environments, where both psychological and physical factors deteriorate over time. After synthesizing all clinical and paraclinical data, the medical board reached a unanimous conclusion that Lena's health condition could not have developed if she had been living freely, with the ability to decide on eating, moving, and seeking basic medical care. The characteristics of malnutrition, fracture patterns, micronutrient deficiencies, and signs of restricted mobility all pointed to a prolonged process of control in which the victim had no access to the minimum living conditions necessary to maintain health. This medical conclusion was formalized into an official report, becoming a critical scientific foundation supporting the criminal investigative direction, while also affirming that throughout the 3 years of disappearance, Lena Whitmore had not lived in a state of freedom, but had been placed in coercive conditions that caused severe and prolonged harm to her body. In parallel with completing the medical file, an independent clinical psychological profile was established for Lena Whitmore to assess the extent of psychological trauma and determine her capacity to participate in any investigative activities without causing further harm to the victim. The evaluation was conducted by a team of psychologists and psychiatrists experienced in cases of long-term confinement victims, using a cautious approach based on clinical observation, non-invasive supportive interviews, and standardized diagnostic scales adjusted to accommodate Lena's physically emaciated condition. From the very first contact sessions, the experts noted a consistent symptom pattern, indicating that Lena fully met the diagnostic criteria for severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The manifestations included persistently heightened vigilance, strong startle responses to small sounds or sudden movements, difficulty maintaining deep sleep, recurrent nightmares, and sudden panic attacks that appeared without clear triggers. In addition to PTSD, Lena displayed clear signs of dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism commonly seen in victims of prolonged trauma, in which consciousness tends to detach from present experiences to reduce painful emotions. The experts observed moments when Lena became absent-minded, her gaze unfocused, with slow responses to speech or the surrounding environment, accompanied by emotional withdrawal when conversations touched on topics related to herself, confined spaces, or control. Notably, Lena had severe difficulty in identifying time markers, unable to arrange events in linear sequence, and even unable to accurately estimate the passage of time across different periods of the 3 years she was missing. This time disorientation phenomenon was explained by the experts as a direct consequence of prolonged trauma combined with a controlled living environment, where normal day-night cycles, daily routines, and time cues were blurred, interrupted, or completely stripped away, causing the brain to lose its ability to anchor to real-time markers. During the evaluation sessions, when Lena was asked to describe personal experiences or attempt to recall a specific event, negative physiological reactions quickly emerged, including trembling hands, increased heart rate, shortness of breath, and clear signs of panic, forcing the experts to stop immediately to avoid re-traumatization. These reactions indicated that Lena's nervous system was still operating in a survival state, prioritizing avoidance over memory processing. Based on the clinical observations and evaluation results, The psychological experts unanimously concluded that attempting to elicit direct testimony from Lena at this stage was not only ineffective, but also carried a serious risk of significant harm to her recovery process. Memories formed or recalled in states of dissociation and severe PTSD tend to be fragmented, lacking coherence, and easily distorted, making them unreliable both clinically and legally. From this, a principled investigative decision was made with consensus among law enforcement, the medical team, and psychological experts: no interrogations, no detailed testimony extraction, and no requirement for Lena to participate in any form of formal statement-taking at the present stage. This decision represented a clear shift in approach, prioritizing victim protection above all, and acknowledging that Lena's mental health was a prerequisite for any sustainable investigative process. Rather than relying on the victim's testimony, investigators were recommended to focus on objective evidence, such as medical data, forensic traces, circumstantial analysis, and other independent sources of information. The psychological profile also emphasized that Lena's recovery process would be prolonged and non-linear, with phases of progress interspersed with setbacks, in which forcing the victim into early contact with traumatic memories could cause long-term harm. Professional recommendations required that every interaction with Lena adhere to trauma-informed principles, minimizing triggering factors as much as possible, and granting the victim control over the pace of exposure to information related to herself. The psychological profile concluded that Lena Whitmore was carrying profound psychological injuries formed in the context of prolonged control, and protecting her from direct investigative pressure was not only an ethical obligation, but also a necessary condition to ensure the integrity of any future legal proceedings. After establishing that Lena Whitmore was not yet psychologically fit to provide direct testimony without risking re-traumatization, the Interagency Investigative Task Force developed a new investigative strategy based on the core principle of proceeding completely independently of the victim's statements, treating all objective data as the sole foundation for reconstructing what had occurred during the 3 years of disappearance. This principle was agreed upon to avoid two major risks: first, harming Lena's psychological recovery process, and second, creating legally unstable, fragmented details due to the influence of PTSD and dissociation. On that basis, the investigative focus was clearly defined, not as who did what in the traditional sense, but as where and how Lena had been held for such an extended period, with top priority given to identifying the confinement space and the long-term survival conditions she had endured. Investigators determined that a confinement space capable of sustaining a person alive for multiple years must meet several minimum criteria, including the ability to conceal from social observation, control of entry and exit, provision of sufficient water and food to maintain life, while creating an environment of restricted movement, consistent with the recorded medical signs. From there, the investigative strategy was divided into 3 closely interconnected major directions. The first direction focused on environmental factors, aiming to identify types of locations likely to match Lena's medical and psychological profile, including enclosed spaces with minimal natural light exposure, signs of temperature control, and potential existence in areas subject to little administrative oversight. Investigators analyzed maps of the broad region between the initial disappearance point and where Lena was discovered, not to trace a specific movement route, but to delineate environments capable of supporting long-term confinement. The second direction focused on logistical factors, considered key to sustaining a victim alive over a long period without detection. The task force constructed hypothetical logistical models, analyzing minimum requirements for food, water, medications, and daily necessities, based on the confirmed malnutrition and micronutrient deficiencies in the medical records. From these models, they assessed the feasibility of supply access for certain individuals or locations, including repeated small quantity purchases to avoid attention, use of natural water sources or private wells, and waste disposal methods that left no unusual traces. Logistical analysis also considered the possibility of a simple yet sustainable supply chain sufficient to maintain life, but inadequate for ensuring health, consistent with Lena's prolonged state of emaciation. The third direction focused on potential individual suspects, but not by immediately compiling a suspect list, rather by identifying groups of people capable of controlling space and logistics over long periods without close supervision. Investigators re-examined Lena's past connections, not to find direct motive, but to identify potential intersection points between individuals and spaces capable of confinement. At the same time, they analyzed records of individuals living relatively isolated, with access to enclosed locations, capable of self-sufficiency, and with a history of avoiding social contact or administrative checks. The investigative strategy also included reviewing indirect data such as fluctuations in electricity and water consumption, unauthorized construction or prolonged repair activities in remote areas, with the goal of identifying anomalies consistent with maintaining a concealed living space. The entire strategy was designed to progressively narrow the scope based on the intersection of environment, logistics, and individuals, rather than relying on the victim's testimony. Investigators agreed that only when this objective picture became sufficiently clear would any future information from Lena be usable as a supplementary element, not as the foundation, ensuring that the investigative process both protected the victim and maintained the accuracy and probability of the case. Precisely from that requirement, the investigative strategy shifted its focus to in-depth environmental forensics, with the goal of transforming the passive signs accumulated on Lena Whitmore's body throughout her confinement period into scientific data capable of tracing the space and objectively narrowing down the crime scene area. As soon as medical conditions permitted, samples of hair, skin, fingernails, and fabric fibers from her clothing were collected under strict preservation protocols to prevent cross-contamination, as the value of environmental traces lies in their originality and long-term accumulation. Pollen analysis in the hair was conducted first, because hair can retain pollen over long cycles and is minimally washed away, even with infrequent water exposure. The results showed a narrow and repetitive pollen spectrum, with a high proportion of drought-tolerant plant species that grow in nutrient-poor soil and high-intensity sunlight conditions commonly found in semi-desert regions. Notably, the cyclical repetition of the same pollen group indicated that Lena had prolonged exposure to a stable plant community, rather than moving through diverse environments, as is typical in urban areas or regions with varied agricultural crops. No common urban landscape pollens such as ornamental grasses, decorative trees, or seasonally planted urban species were detected, indicating that the exposure environment was not within a regularly managed artificial ecosystem. In parallel, mineral analysis of deposits on the skin, particularly in creases and under the fingernails, provided critical data on the geological substrate. The samples showed a stable presence of micro-sized silicate particles, rich in weathered quartz, feldspar, and associated minerals commonly found in semi-desert soils with high gravel content. The ion ratios and surface structures of the dust particles reflected prolonged deposition processes, with signs of repeated reaccumulation, ruling out short-term exposure over just days or weeks. In particular, no significant concentrations of characteristic urban dust components, such as black carbon from traffic, industrial heavy metals, or microplastic fibers were found, reinforcing the conclusion that Lena had not lived in an urban environment for an extended period. Forensic geologists also noted traces of finely crystallized mineral salts on the skin surface, a phenomenon common in areas with high evaporation rates, large day-night temperature swings, and limited water sources, where sweat and moisture evaporate quickly, leaving distinctive mineral residues. Rare microbial analysis continued to add an independent layer of data. The samples revealed the presence of drought-tolerant, high radiation-resistant strains of bacteria and filamentous fungi that tend to inhabit undisturbed bare soil, where water cycles are short and living conditions are harsh. These strains were distinctly different from the microbial communities typically found in enclosed urban spaces, which are dominated by air conditioning, stable humidity, and high human density. The simultaneous appearance of these drought-resistant microorganisms on hair, skin, and fabric fibers indicated repeated and prolonged contact with natural soil, inconsistent with a scenario of short-term confinement in an ordinary indoor space. Based on these results, the forensic team conducted a systematic elimination process. Urban environments were ruled out due to the absence of pollution indicators and artificial biodiversity, as well as the lack of industrial construction materials that typically adhere to the body when living in city spaces. The short-term confinement hypothesis was rejected because the accumulated traces showed exposure over multiple ecological cycles, exceeding what could form in a brief period. There was no evidence of frequent contact with cement, paint, synthetic fibers, or high levels of household chemical compounds, indicating that the place where Lena lived was not a standard continuously used residential structure. Comparative models were built by matching the collected data against a large regional environmental library, including standard samples from various geographic zones, to determine the degree of ecological similarity. The comparison results showed the highest match with semi-desert areas outside formal urban management systems, where infrastructure is sparse, administrative oversight is minimal, and numerous spontaneous enclosed spaces or unregistered structures exist. These areas share the common characteristic of easily concealing prolonged human activity without generating unusual energy or water consumption signals in public systems. From the synthesis of pollen, mineral and microbial data, the environmental forensic conclusion was reached consistently and cautiously. Lena Whitmore had been confined in a semi-desert area outside the formal urban system, characterized by aridity, minimal human intervention, and sufficient isolation for ecological traces to accumulate on her body over a long period without dilution. This conclusion does not aim to pinpoint a specific location, but serves to narrow the investigative space according to ecological criteria, eliminate incompatible scenarios, and provide a clear environmental framework to guide subsequent analytical steps based on objective data. Based on this result, the Interagency Investigative Task Force moved into the geographic delimitation phase, where the abstract ecological characteristics were transformed into specific areas that could be field verified through operational means. In order to concentrate resources efficiently and increase the likelihood of identifying potential confinement locations for Lena Whitmore. This process was constructed using a multi-layered filtering method, in which each criterion was applied to progressively eliminate unsuitable areas, rather than attempting to immediately identify a single point. The first filtering layer focused on distance from major transportation routes and high-traffic infrastructure corridors. Investigators agreed that maintaining the confinement of a victim for multiple years in areas close to highways, federal roads, or busy traffic arteries was not feasible, due to the excessive risk of random discovery, camera recording, or unintended social interaction. Therefore, all areas within direct access range of major transportation routes were excluded from consideration, especially those with regular vehicle traffic or ongoing commercial activity. Traffic data was overlaid with topographic maps and population density to identify off-axis regions where movement could occur infrequently and without drawing attention. The second filtering layer focused on the factor of limited but stable water sources, a key criterion derived from Lena's medical records. Previous analyses showed that Lena did not suffer acute dehydration leading to death, but exhibited signs of chronic water deficiency, implying that the confinement location had a water source sufficient to sustain minimal life, but inadequate to ensure health. From this, investigators ruled out areas entirely dependent on municipal water systems, as such systems easily leave consumption traces and require regular maintenance. Instead, they concentrated on regions capable of accessing private wells, shallow groundwater, improvised water tanks, or seasonal streams, where water could be manually extracted without formal registration. Hydrological and climatic data were used to eliminate areas that were excessively arid, where long-term survival would be unfeasible, while also excluding regions with overly abundant water sources, inconsistent with the mineral crystallization traces recorded on the victim's body. The third filtering layer concerned the feasibility of long-term survival in a controlled space, based on medical and psychological indicators showing that Lena had restricted movement and lived in enclosed conditions. Investigators searched for areas capable of supporting structures sufficiently sealed to shield from harsh weather, stable enough to maintain acceptable temperature ranges, and isolated enough to avoid social contact. These structures did not necessarily need to be standard homes, but could include unregistered cabins, converted sheds, semi-subterranean basements, makeshift constructions, or buildings on remote private land, with minimal administrative inspection. To identify such locations, the task force used high-resolution satellite imagery combined with cadastral data, searching for signs of long-term existence, such as small access roads, stable structure shadows, and very minimal changes over time, factors suggesting a structure in use but not frequently upgraded or publicly repaired. The delimitation process also integrated previously developed logistical analyses, requiring each potential area to support minimal food access without creating unusual purchasing patterns. Investigators ruled out completely isolated regions where regular resupply would be impractical, as well as areas too close to commercial centers or residential zones where even small periodic shopping would draw notice. A survival circle model was applied, requiring each site to simultaneously meet three conditions: far enough to avoid social monitoring, close enough for the controller to discreetly maintain logistics, and sealed enough to restrict the victim's movement over a long period. Areas failing to fully meet all three conditions were eliminated, even if only one factor was missing. Through multiple rounds of filtering and cross-referencing among traffic, hydrological, topographic, and infrastructure data, the investigative scope was significantly narrowed from a vast semi-desert region to several discrete clusters of areas, each cluster containing locations with similar geographic features and survival conditions. This narrowing did not aim to immediately identify the specific confinement site, but transformed an immense investigative space into a finite set of priority areas that could be systematically field-checked. By the end of the delimitation phase, the task force reached consensus that the remaining areas were consistent with the objective data established from medical, psychological, and environmental forensic records, while being sufficiently isolated from conventional monitoring systems to allow prolonged confinement to occur undetected. After the priority geographic clusters had been established, the investigative task force launched a parallel new operational branch focused entirely on supply traces, viewing this as the most important behavioral indicator to verify the hypothesis of prolonged confinement under discrete conditions. The approach agreed upon from the outset was not to pursue large stockpiling or credit card-linked transactions, as those forms typically leave clear financial data trails that are easily detected early on. Instead, investigators concentrated on small scattered transactions over time, occurring at stores outside the usual consumer orbit of urban residents, where customer identity recording is almost non-existent or purely nominal. The list of locations to review was built based on maps of sparsely populated areas, including long-standing family-run grocery stores, small gas stations at dirt road intersections, agricultural supply stores that also sell daily necessities, and some outlets serving hunters, forest visitors, or short-term project workers. At these sites, the task force not only collected preserved receipts, but also conducted detailed interviews with store owners and long-term employees to reconstruct unusual purchasing patterns that simple accounting systems could not fully reflect. The analysis focus was not on transaction value, but on the consistency of purchased item types, payment methods, and the absence of signs tied to normal daily life, such as family shopping, seasonal purchases, or community event-related buying. Through the extended review process, several chains of small transactions began to emerge with notably matching characteristics. These transactions often occurred on no fixed cycle, sometimes weeks or months apart, but repeatedly involved the same group of basic life-sustaining items, such as shelf-stable dry foods, small bottled drinking water, salt, flour, cooking oil, batteries, soap, gauze, and common antiseptics. Notably, these items never appeared alongside products for social living or long-term comfort, such as entertainment items, new clothing, or decorative goods, indicating that the shopping purpose was strictly limited to bare minimum survival maintenance. Many store owners describe these customers as tending to avoid conversation, not lingering to chat, not inquiring about the local community, and rarely buying from a long list, as though they had precisely calculated the exact quantities needed in advance. Payment was predominantly in cash, sometimes with old bills, with no request for detailed receipts, and no contact information left behind, consistent with deliberate avoidance of any paper trail. When these transactions were overlaid onto the previously delimited geographic map, investigators noticed that several purchasing points fell within reasonable travel radius from parcels of land, showing signs of existing cabins or unregistered structures. The dirt roads connecting the stores to these areas were typically poorly maintained, lacked traffic cameras, and were rarely used by random passers-by, facilitating discreet movement without drawing attention. Analysis of shopping timing also showed that transactions usually took place during low traffic hours, avoiding morning or evening rush periods, reducing the chance of being remembered or identified by multiple witnesses. Some stores recorded the same customer returning after long intervals with an almost unchanged appearance, showing no signs of regular residence in the area, suggesting that the person did not live nearby, but appeared specifically for targeted resupply. The task force also considered the possibility that these transactions related to long-term camping or voluntary outdoor living, but this hypothesis was gradually ruled out when cross-referenced with Lena's medical records, which showed she lacked the ability to move freely or self-care under harsh conditions. Additionally, the supply transactions did not include purchases of specialized outdoor gear, such as gas stoves, tents, climbing equipment, or repair tools, items that typically appear in voluntary survival behavior. Another noted factor was the complete absence of fresh food or cold storage, requiring goods, indicating that the supply chain was designed to minimize shopping frequency and reduce the need for modern infrastructure access. When store owners' accounts were cross-checked against data on unregistered cabins, investigators observed that several areas showed signs of long-term maintenance, despite lacking official residency records, consistent with a discrete confinement model reliant on drip-feed resupply. These areas lacked community activity signs, did not appear in local tax reports, and rarely had public service requests, yet displayed indirect evidence of prolonged human presence, such as repeatedly used trails or temporary repair traces. The supply trace analysis, therefore, did not aim to identify the specific buyer, but to reconstruct a logistical behavior pattern, consistent with long-term confinement of an individual, without generating large enough anomalies to be detected early. The data gathered in this phase allowed the task force to further eliminate areas lacking matching supply indicators, while directing attention to geographic clusters where small-scale, discrete, prolonged purchasing behavior appeared alongside off-grid structures, forming a consistent chain of indicators, pointing to the possible existence of a confinement site sustained by minimal but intentional logistics. From the geographic data and analyzed supply chains, the investigative task force moved to the suspect individual review phase by cross-referencing atypical residency records with behaviors consistent with the discrete confinement model, in which Caleb Rourke, 48 years old, emerged as a prominent case. Administrative records showed that Rourke had lived in isolation for many years, without standard residency registration, and leaving almost no trace of activity in public utility systems. He had no family living with him, did not participate in local community activities, and rarely appeared in social spaces, such as central stores, residential events, or service facilities. For the most part, Rourke was only sporadically recorded appearing in the fringe areas of the semi-desert region, where population density was low and movement attracted little attention. Rourke's employment history indicated that he had previously worked in applied geology, participating in terrain surveys, soil and rock structure assessments, and groundwater source identification for small-scale extraction projects. This work allowed Rourke to accumulate practical knowledge of rugged terrain, the ability to construct semi-subterranean structures, and methods for sustaining living conditions in harsh environments without modern infrastructure. After leaving the industry, Rourke did not return to any stable employment, instead living off accumulated finances and informal short-term labor agreements, which partly explained the lack of regular income traces in the tax system. Local law enforcement reports noted that Rourke had on multiple occasions reacted strongly to the presence of strangers near the land he frequented, including demanding they leave, erecting improvised warning signs, and in some cases filing complaints despite lacking clear legal grounds. These behaviors were described as antisocial, reflecting a high need for control over living space and pronounced discomfort with any form of intrusion. When cross-referencing the areas Rourke frequently appeared in with the geographic delimitation map, investigators noted significant overlap between his range of movement and the clusters showing signs of existing cabins or unregistered structures. Several structures in these areas lacked land tax records or building permits, yet displayed signs of long-term maintenance, such as repeatedly used trails, crude repair traces, and structural stability across multi-year satellite imagery. The dirt roads leading to these structures also aligned with the discrete access routes identified in logistical analysis, with minimal intersection with main highways and outside the view of common surveillance systems. When reviewing accounts from remote store owners, the task force found multiple descriptions of a middle-aged male customer whose purchasing behavior matched Rourke's profile, including cash payments, purchases of dry foods and basic medical supplies at irregular intervals, avoidance of conversation, and never revealing personal information. Some store owners recalled that this person typically appeared during low traffic hours, never bought excess, and quickly departed via secondary routes, characteristics consistent with deliberate avoidance of forming recognizable consumption patterns. Cross-referencing shopping times with Rourke's unofficial activity schedule showed notable coincidences, particularly in the period following Lena Whitmore's disappearance, when Rourke significantly reduced long-distance travel and appeared more frequently within the filtered region without clear work-related reasons. Deeper analysis of Rourke's professional background showed that he possessed sufficient skills to independently build and maintain temporary structures for long-term habitation, including handling soil and rock, creating sealed spaces to protect against harsh weather, and exploiting groundwater at minimal levels. These skills were assessed as consistent with the medical and environmental forensic signs recorded on Lena's body, which indicated restricted movement in an enclosed yet thermally stable space with basic living conditions. Additionally, Rourke's non-use of grid electricity, municipal water, or waste collection services explained why a habitation or confinement site, if existing within his sphere of influence, would leave no typical administrative traces. Rourke's prior administrative violation record, including cases of unauthorized entry onto public land and obstruction of third-party surveys, showed that he was accustomed to operating outside formal legal boundaries for extended periods without detection. When investigators placed Rourke's personal factors, social behavior, professional background, and geographic connections side by side in a unified analytical framework, the degree of match with the prolonged discrete confinement model became sufficiently clear to allow shifting the focus from hypothesis to field verification. On that basis, the examination of the confinement site was carried out at an isolated cabin located deep within the previously delimited area, accessed via a narrow dirt road that only allowed slow vehicle movement, not appearing on standard traffic maps, where signs of human intervention blended into the semi-desert landscape in a sufficiently discrete way to exist outside attention for a long period. From the outside, the cabin displayed characteristics of a long-existing but unofficial structure, with crude, non-uniform building materials, many sections reinforced in different phases, reflecting a prolonged process of use and adjustment rather than a complete construction project. Investigators noted continuous but minimal signs of habitation, including layered fireplace ash accumulation, unevenly worn surfaces from repeated contact, and selectively cleaned areas, indicating the space was used regularly but under control. Inside the cabin, the spatial layout was organized to restrict visibility and mobility, with temporary partitions, narrow doors, and narrowed passageways that forced anyone inside to move only in certain directions. These structures showed no signs of randomness, but clearly demonstrated intent to control, as functional areas were separated to reduce free access while creating one-way observation points from specific positions within the cabin. The floor showed localized wear in certain fixed areas, consistent with one person having to stand, sit, or lie within a restricted range for extended periods, while other areas showed almost no signs of use. Investigators also discovered details indicating that habitation occurred under maximum resource conservation conditions, such as simple cooking utensils, a small food preparation surface, and no signs of large stockpiling, consistent with the previously identified small-scale supply chain. The cabin's ventilation system was created through crude gaps and ducts, sufficient to maintain air circulation, but not allowing direct observation from outside, while limiting the ability of anyone inside to escape without external assistance. Natural light inside the cabin was severely restricted, with small windows shielded or placed high up, making time orientation based on day-night cycles difficult, an element consistent with the psychological profile showing the victim's loss of ability to identify time markers. Investigators noted that the sleeping area was arranged simply, without a standard bed, just a fixed zone with a hard surface covered by a thin material, indicating prolonged existence, but not aimed at creating comfort. These traces did not reflect direct violent abuse, but demonstrated a form of passive control through a restricted living environment, where freedom was stripped away by spatial structure rather than overt coercive acts. Notably, investigators found no signs of struggle, blood, or structural damage from direct violence, which aligned with the medical records showing no acute injuries in the period near when Lena was discovered. Instead, every detail in the cabin indicated the maintenance of a stable, controlled state, where the victim was forced to adapt to a limited space without the need for frequent violence. Sanitation areas were designed separately and at a minimal level, with signs of long-term use, but no modern upgrades, reflecting the maintenance of basic living under deprivation conditions. Waste and wastewater traces showed deliberate management to avoid odors and easily detectable signs, reinforcing the assessment that the cabin was used with a high awareness of concealment. In addition, the absence of diverse personal items or signs of personal decoration indicated that this space was not regarded as a voluntary residence, but as an imposed environment, where all excess elements were eliminated to reduce resupply needs and external dependence. Investigators also noted that certain areas in the cabin showed signs of being locked or blocked from the outside, though not with standard metal locks but using wooden bars, crude bolts, or heavy objects, sufficient to prevent opening from inside without creating clear signs of violence. These details indicated a confinement method based on spatial and survival condition control, rather than direct physical force. Overall, the crime scene showed this was not a random space, but an environment deliberately designed and adjusted over time to sustain the victim's life in a state of restricted movement and social isolation, while avoiding leaving publicly recognizable overt violence traces, fully consistent with the investigative hypotheses formed earlier. From this crime scene foundation, the analysis was expanded to the confinement mechanism, by synthesizing the material data at the cabin with Lena Whitmore's medical and psychological records and the established supply chain, thereby clarifying a systematic control model in which manipulating the victim's life rhythm and mental state played a central role rather than direct violence. Investigators observed that Lena's activity cycle was most likely tightly imposed according to a repeating schedule, not aimed at optimizing health, but at maintaining dependency and reducing resistance capability. This cycle was inferred from habitation traces in the cabin, including stove usage times, consistently low but regular food consumption amounts, and the distribution of wear in fixed areas, showing the victim was forced to eat, rest, and move within limited, inflexible time frames, with no right to choose. Control of biological rhythms through restricted natural light, small windows, and enclosed space blurred day-night boundaries, making it difficult for the victim to maintain a sense of time, thereby weakening the ability to plan and nurture hope of escape from the current situation. In parallel with the imposed activity cycle was a psychological reward-punishment mechanism designed to shape behavior without the need for frequent physical violence. Investigators inferred that rewards could be in very basic forms, such as slightly larger food portions, brief access to light or more space, or simply the controller's presence, while punishments did not need to involve beatings, but could consist of food reduction, extended isolation periods, or further restricted movement within the cabin. Lena's medical records showed prolonged malnutrition, but not reaching acute levels, consistent with food portions being deliberately adjusted up and down to sustain life while creating continuous unease. These small but repeated fluctuations were assessed as sufficient to keep the victim in a constant state of dependency, forcing behavioral adjustment to avoid negative consequences, even when punishments did not cause direct harm. Another core element of the confinement mechanism was near absolute social isolation, not only spatially, but also psychologically. Lena had no contact with any other individuals besides the controller, and even this presence was likely limited and not normal communication. The complete absence of other social relationships gradually eroded the ability to define self through interaction, causing the victim to lose a sense of her place in the outside world. Investigators noted there were no signs that the victim was given access to news, seasons, or any elements reminding her of social flow, consistent with the recorded psychological profile of inability to identify time markers. Prolonged isolation combined with the lack of multifaceted social feedback created an environment where the victim's perception gradually narrowed to the confinement space, reducing motivation to seek escape and increasing passive compliance levels. The psychological control mechanism was further reinforced through limited predictability of interactions, as the victim could not anticipate the controller's reactions or behaviors, making baseline tension a constant state. This tension, according to psychological experts consulted by the task force, could lead to passive adaptation, where the victim accepts adverse conditions as normal to reduce internal conflict. The dissociation signs recorded in Lena aligned with the mind's attempt to detach from a controlled reality, a reaction commonly seen in prolonged confinement cases without frequent violence. Notably, the entire mechanism did not require the constant presence of the captor, but relied on designing the environment and living rules so that the victim self-adjusted behavior, even without direct supervision. This explained why the cabin showed no signs of guarding or modern control devices yet still maintained the confinement state over a long period. Investigators concluded that this was a systematic form of confinement, where control was internalized into the victim's behavior and perception, rather than imposed through physical force. The avoidance of frequent direct violence also reduced the risk of leaving clear forensic traces while allowing the controller to maintain a long-term stable state without escalation. From these analyses, the confinement mechanism emerged as a multi-layered structure operated stably, in which spatial control, adjustment of survival needs, minimal reward-punishment manipulation, and social isolation were tightly combined, with psychological control playing the key role in sustaining the prolonged confinement. On that foundation of the mechanism, the investigative focus continued to shift toward explaining why an individual would build and maintain such a control system, leading to an analysis of criminal motive through cross-referencing the suspect's behavioral history with the established confinement structure, clarifying the intertwining of possessive paranoia and prolonged social failure in the need for absolute control over the victim. Investigators and psychological experts observed in the suspect a distorted perception model of human relationships, where social bonds were not viewed as two-way interactions, but as objects that could be possessed, arranged, and adjusted according to personal will. The history of isolated living, severed relationships, and strong reactions to spatial intrusion indicated the suspect's tendency to regard the outside world as a constant threat, while only feeling safe when every element was under absolute control. In that context, the victim was not perceived as an independent individual, but as an entity reduced in value to a tool for satisfying the controller's psychological needs. Prolonged social failure, manifested through inability to maintain stable employment, build family or community relationships, contributed to nurturing a sense of deprivation and simmering resentment. thereby intensifying the need to assert power in an alternative space where the suspect could establish his own rules without challenge. Experts analyzed that in this case, the motive did not stem from material gain or momentary conflict, but from the desire to create a closed reality where the suspect held an absolute central role and did not have to face judgment or failure. The prolonged confinement behavior was seen as a means to restructure the suspect's personal identity, with control over another person becoming the sole remaining proof of self-worth. Possessive paranoia was clearly evident in the design of the confinement mechanism, in which the victim was severed from all social ties, lost the ability to track time, and gradually had personal identifying elements stripped away, from name, daily habits, to basic choices. The restriction of light, imposition of activity cycles, and control of reward punishment not only served to maintain order, but also to erode the victim's sense of self, tying her existence tightly to the control system established by the suspect. Investigators concluded that this process reflected a desire to erase the victim's identity, not in a physical sense, but psychologically and socially, where all signs of an independent human being were gradually replaced by a passive role within a closed structure. The motive for absolute control was further reinforced by the suspect's specialized knowledge and skills, enabling him to create an environment just sufficient to sustain life, but never exceeding the threshold that would allow the victim full recovery or regain autonomy. This demonstrated a high degree of calculation and persistence in maintaining prolonged dependency, consistent with the behavioral pattern of individuals seeking total power as compensation for helplessness in other areas of life. Psychological experts noted that the absence of frequent direct violence did not diminish the danger level of the motive. On the contrary, it reflected a more sophisticated control strategy, where fear did not come from blows but from uncertainty, and the gradual sense of being erased from the outside world. In this context, the criminal motive was not a momentary outburst, but the result of a long-term accumulation process, where possessive paranoia was nurtured by social failure, leading to the need to construct a parallel reality in which the suspect held life and death psychological power over the victim. The analyses also indicated that choosing a stranger victim with no direct social connection to the suspect reduced the risk of detection, while facilitating the identity erasure process, as the victim's initial disappearance could be interpreted as an accident or disorientation in the wilderness environment. This aligned with how the suspect exploited terrain and surveillance gaps to realize his motive over an extended period. From a behavioral perspective, maintaining prolonged confinement not only reflected the need to control the victim, but also reinforced the suspect's distorted worldview, where personal power was placed above the independent existence of others, turning any sign of autonomy into a threat that needed to be eliminated. When this psychological picture was placed alongside the established behavioral, geographic, and logistical data, the investigative task force reached consensus that the necessary conditions had converged to shift from the surveillance phase to prosecutorial action, paving the way for arrest and bringing the case before the judicial system with the goal of ensuring safety and clear legal accountability. Surveillance of the suspect was conducted over multiple days using indirect methods, without close approach, and without revealing the presence of law enforcement, focusing on recording movement patterns, times of appearance on secondary routes, and scattered activity signs consistent with the previously established model. During this phase, surveillance units noted the suspect beginning to change habits, including shortening stops at familiar points, increasing observation of surroundings, and avoiding unnecessary contact, indicating a significant rise in alertness. When the suspect suddenly left the isolated cabin area at an unusual hour and moved in a direction away from previous activity routes, the command team assessed this as a potential flight indicator, especially given the suspect's likely awareness of detection risk. The intervention decision was made swiftly to prevent the suspect from disappearing into more inaccessible areas or destroying key evidence. The interagency force was deployed on multiple fronts, using the semi-desert terrain to establish layered encirclements, with narrow dirt roads and natural intersection points controlled from a distance to maximize limitation of escape routes. The suspect attempted to avoid main traffic arteries, moving through rough terrain with the goal of shaking pursuit, but the lack of vehicle flexibility and the pre-predicted secondary routes quickly neutralized this effort. As the encirclement gradually closed in, law enforcement maintained a safe distance, avoiding sudden close approach, while using loudspeakers and clear signals to order the suspect to stop and comply, preventing excessive psychological pressure that could lead to reckless behavior. The suspect displayed prolonged hesitation, continuously scanning surroundings and evaluating remaining escape options, but upon realizing all movement directions were controlled and safe withdrawal was impossible, he was forced to reduce resistance. The takedown was executed according to standard protocol, with body control measures to ensure the suspect posed no danger to himself or the force, while avoiding excessive force. After the suspect was fully secured, units conducted a search of person and vehicle per regulations, seizing items directly related to habitation and logistics, including tools used in the semi-desert environment, consumer supplies matching the identified small-scale supply chain, and some scattered notes reflecting activity and movement schedules. In parallel with the arrest, other teams were ordered to seal off and preserve related sites to prevent destruction of remaining evidence, ensuring crime scene integrity for subsequent processing. Evidence collection was conducted carefully, focusing on items capable of proving the link between the suspect and the analyzed confinement mechanism, including spatial control devices, movement restriction tools, and signs indicating prolonged habitation under enclosed conditions. Throughout the process, law enforcement maintained minimal communication with the suspect, avoiding exchanges beyond operational necessities, to prevent unpredictable psychological situations. The entire arrest operation took place within a tightly controlled time frame, with seamless coordination among units to ensure the suspect had no further ability to move, conceal, or pose danger, while fully preserving the material elements necessary for the subsequent legal proceedings. The trial was opened after the investigation was completed, and the suspect was detained, with the indictment focusing on the two main charges of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, reflecting the prolonged and systematic nature of the criminal behavior rather than a single incident. The prosecutor presented to the jury a tight timeline, beginning from the moment Lena Whitmore went missing, extending through 3 years of confinement in enclosed conditions, until she was discovered in a state of severe emaciation, emphasizing that the entire period could not be explained by an accident or voluntary survival. The centerpiece of the evidence presentation was environmental forensics, used to prove that the victim had been held in a semi-desert area outside the urban system, with pollen, mineral, and microbial analyses from Lena's body, directly matching the ecological characteristics of the isolated cabin that had been examined. Forensic experts explained in court that these traces could not form in a short time and were inconsistent with freely moving through multiple different environments, thereby refuting any argument that the victim might have wandered or voluntarily lived off the grid. Next, the confinement crime scene was presented through photographs, diagrams, and detailed examination reports, clarifying the spatial control structure, partitions, restricted passageways, and signs of long-term minimal habitation, all indicating that this was not a voluntary residence, but an environment designed to limit movement and enforce social isolation. The prosecutor emphasized that the absence of direct violence traces did not diminish the severity of the crime. On the contrary, it demonstrated a sophisticated confinement method based on environmental and psychological control to maintain the victim's long-term dependency. Lena's medical records were introduced as another pillar of evidence, with doctors and psychological experts explaining the prolonged malnutrition, untreated old fractures, specific micronutrient deficiencies, and severe PTSD manifestations, dissociation, and loss of ability to identify time markers, all consistent with prolonged restricted movement and isolation. The prosecution argued that these injuries could not result from a short period or voluntary circumstances, but reflected a continuous and deliberate process of control. The defense attempted to question the motive and degree of coercion, arguing that there was no evidence of direct violence or physical locks, but this argument was countered by presenting the analyzed confinement mechanism, in which psychological control, imposed activity cycles, and reward punishment played the key role, making the absence of physical violence not equivalent to freedom or consent. Expert witnesses explained to the jury that unlawful imprisonment does not require chains, locks, or injuries to constitute the crime, but only requires proving that the victim was unlawfully deprived of the right to move and make decisions freely, which had been demonstrated through the entire chain of objective evidence. In the closing argument, the prosecutor synthesized the pieces from environmental forensics, the confinement crime scene, and medical records into a consistent picture of a prolonged planned criminal act that caused severe harm to the victim's body and mind, stressing that this was a form of silent but profoundly destructive violence. After deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on both counts, confirming that the defendant's actions fully met the elements of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment under the law. The judge sentenced the defendant to life imprisonment, citing the particularly grave nature of the case, the extended duration of confinement, the degree of irreversible harm to the victim, and the risk of recidivism if the defendant were to return to society, while emphasizing that the sentence was not only intended to punish, but also to affirm the legal principle that controlling and depriving another person of freedom, even without clear traces of violence, remains one of the most serious violations of human dignity and rights. After the life sentence was pronounced and all procedural steps were completed, the case file was officially closed on the legal level, shifting from the investigation-prosecution phase to archiving and long-term consequence monitoring, where the focus was no longer on the suspect or the dismantled criminal system, but on the victim's current condition and the irreversible repercussions left by the case. Lena Whitmore is still alive, a reality once considered impossible throughout the 3 years she was presumed dead, but that survival does not equate to returning to her pre-disappearance state. Updated medical assessments show that Lena has passed the critical phase, with more stable vital signs, improved body weight, and severe micronutrient deficiencies brought under control at an acceptable level. However, her body bears many chronic injuries that cannot fully recover. Old untreated bone injuries have led to long-term mobility limitations, persistent pain, and early degeneration risk, making it difficult for Lena to return to a normal physical life as before. Parallel to the physical issues are profound psychological injuries, assessed as structural, rather than merely temporary reactions to trauma. Lena continues to be diagnosed with severe PTSD, featuring unpredictable panic attacks, prolonged sleep disturbances, and periods of dissociation causing temporary disconnection from reality. Her ability to identify time markers and construct a sense of life's flow remains disrupted, requiring long-term rehabilitation therapies focused on rebuilding a sense of safety and personal control. Socially, Lena cannot immediately reintegrate into old relationships, as 3 years of near-absolute isolation disrupted the normal psychological development of a young adult, creating a hard-to-fill gap between her and the outside world. Simple social interactions, once taken for granted, now become sources of stress, as Lena must relearn how to trust, choose, and establish personal boundaries that were completely stripped away before. Social rehabilitation experts assess that this process has no clear endpoint, but will extend over many years with small advances interspersed with setbacks, heavily dependent on consistent support from the healthcare system, family, and community. Lena's family, though reunited with a loved one once thought lost, also faces a complex reality where the joy of survival comes alongside the responsibility of long-term care and the acceptance that the returned person is no longer the version from the past. The case, though legally closed, leaves lingering questions about the ability to detect early nonviolent forms of confinement, about surveillance gaps in off-grid areas, and about how society evaluates the danger level of sophisticated but prolonged control behaviors. For law enforcement agencies, the case becomes a reference file, underscoring that the absence of direct violence does not equate to low harm severity, and that environmental forensic, medical, and psychological signs may be the only key to unraveling crimes that occur in silence. For Lena, The present is not defined by closure or ending, but by a process of continuing to live under incomplete recovery conditions, where each day is a negotiation between endurance, fragmented memories, and the effort to rebuild an identity once erased. The long-term consequences of the case extend beyond her body and mind, to how the surrounding community views safety, the fragility of personal freedom, and the price paid when a human being is deprived of the right to exist as an independent subject for an extended period. The story of Lena Whitmore is not just an isolated case, but reflects very real risks that exist in American life today, especially in spaces that modern society pays little attention to. Lena vanished during a solo hiking trip in Havasu Canyon, a setting familiar to American culture, where the spirit of freedom, exploration of nature, and personal independence is celebrated. However, the very belief that nature only brings random danger led the case to be initially attributed to a terrain accident, resulting in the file being closed too soon. The first lesson here is danger does not only come from nature, but also from people who exploit society's surveillance gaps. The case of Caleb Rourke shows that individuals living in isolation, off the grid, are not necessarily criminals, but when combined with antisocial behavior, prolonged failure, and a need for control, they can become a serious threat if not given proper attention. Second, the story underscores that violence does not always take the form of blood and injuries. Lena was confined through spatial control, imposed activity cycles, social isolation, and psychological manipulation, forms of silent violence that leave lifelong consequences. In the current context of the United States, where many people live alone, work remotely, and become increasingly detached from community, recognizing signs of control, isolation, and psychological dependency in relationships has become as important as preventing traditional violent crime. Finally, Lena's incomplete recovery journey reminds us that criminal justice does not equate to the end of trauma. American society, with its strong legal system, still needs to invest more in post-trauma care, long-term victim support, and building community networks sensitive enough to detect abnormalities before a person is erased from shared life in silence. If you are interested in true stories that expose the hidden dark side beneath our seemingly safe daily lives, please subscribe to the channel to follow along and reflect on the lessons left by cases like Lena Whitmore's. Thank you for staying until the end of the story, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to dive deep into files that seemed closed but still echo in today's life.